Stanford looking to make it 9 consecutive wins over UCLA. The two teams meet Saturday night at the Rose Bowl. We bring in Nick Dempsey from Rule of Tree to set up Stanford and UCLA. The Cardinal, of course, off to a 2-0 start. Nick, looking in pretty good shape when we look at the UCLA Bruins. Tough loss in overtime in Week 1 against Texas A&M, but against a very good Texas A&M team, so no shame there. They got by BYU last week in a low-scoring game. Josh Rosen is the wonder kid coming off a successful freshman season, but having his issues right now, not necessarily scoring tons of points and not necessarily playing well against a pass rush.
Yeah, there's a couple of things I think you got to remember about Josh Rosen. I don't want to take anything away from the kid. He is amazingly, amazingly talented. But he is still a sophomore. You know, he's not even old enough to drink legally, I don't think. He's still a young kid. And so he's going to make mistakes that sophomores make when you put pressure on him or when you disguise coverages. He's just not there yet. It's maybe weird, a little bit weird for Stanford fans who have had Kevin Hogan there for literally forever. But Josh Rosen is still relatively new, even though this is his second year as a starter. The other thing you got to remember is they've got almost an entirely new wide receiver core, so they've got to get all those guys synced up with their quarterbacks. And I believe their running backs are also all new. So sort of everyone around Josh Rosen is new, and this kid's still pretty young himself. So, you know, your leadership is young, and you've got to get everybody on the same page. So when you disguise coverages and put pressure on him, there's a tendency he throws a lot of interceptions. I believe he had 3 against A&M. But at the same time, you know, it was very costly, those interceptions against A&M, and they went down pretty big. But his talent and their offensive explosion, they came back and were able to take it to overtime. I think that's the testament. It's very boom or bust still, which is what you get for young phenoms, I think, a lot, is that they make a lot of mistakes, but they have the talent to correct them and kind of come back. So the question is, can they do that against Stanford? Can he, if he makes a lot of mistakes, because you know Stanford's going to bring the pressure on him, and you know Stanford's secondary is quite skilled. This is one of the best. They're certainly much better than they were last year. If he does throw 3+ interceptions, is he going to be able to climb back and get back into the game like he was against Texas A&M? Now, if he plays a clean game and he goes, 22 for 27 with 350 plus and 3 touchdowns, yeah, that's good. Then you really got to like UCLA there. But if you get pressure on him, he starts making mistakes, is going to be able to claw his way back, especially when you got McCaffrey and the gang on the other side of the ball chewing up clock and scoring touchdowns.
Yeah, they lost Paul Perkins at running back, who won a rushing title in the Pac-12 2 years ago, finished 3rd behind Christian McCaffrey and Royce Freeman last season. And they lost Jordan Payton, their number 1 receiver, to the NFL as well. They actually have 6 guys, Nick, who have caught between 6 and 10 passes. So Rosen is playing like a veteran quarterback when it comes to distributing the football. It's all over the place. You don't know where they're going to go with the ball. The biggest threats to date through 3 games have been Darren Andrews, 10 receptions and a touchdown, and Kenneth Walker, the third, 9 receptions and a touchdown. But it's gone all over the place in the UCLA passing game, so that could be a positive or negative that they don't have a go-to guy, a big play guy, but that you can't key on one guy necessarily in the passing game. Stanford, of course, with 2 solid efforts against Kansas State and USC, doing what Stanford does, not giving up big plays on defense, limiting, certainly playing their kind of football and their style of football in controlling the game.
I think what makes this game interesting, and what I think makes hard to predict for a lot of folks, is that UCLA does have a lot of talent on defense. It just so happens that it's been, injured or had all kinds of issues. Their D-line, as of now, is healthy, intact. They've got the big fella, Eddie Vanderdoes. He's going to be there. So I think it's safe to say this is probably the best defensive front Stanford's seen all season. Granted, it's not a big sample size, but it'll be interesting to see if they can get McCaffrey going for 5+ a carry. If they can get Bryce Love going to mix it up and get it outside. Can they grind away? Because remember one of the big question marks about the Stanford team was they're replacing 3 guys in the offensive line. And they kind of had their struggles against Kansas State, who would bring 6 to 8 guys on every play. USC had plenty of other struggles. But can this offensive line, which has only had 2 games under the belt so far, can they grind it out against a hyper-talented UCLA defensive front? That's going to be interesting. And if they can't, can David Shaw and Coach Bloomgren mix it up on offense, get guys the ball out in space or away from that line and attack some of the weaker spots on the UCLA defense? So this could be a very smash-mouth football game, and we could find out an awful lot about the Stanford offensive line this game. And I think that's what I'm most excited to see. I think this is going to be a huge test for them.
A couple other standouts on defense for UCLA include Jayon Brown. He's got 23 tackles. He's got a tackle for loss and a sack. Kenny Young is a guy that we knew going into the season as well that was going to be one of the standouts in the Pac-12. 2 sacks, 2 tackles for loss. And a lot of the great recruiting classes in the secondary have come to fruition in the form of guys like Fabian Moreau and Tahan Goodman. Ishmael Adams has actually switched from defensive back to wide receiver and has 5 or 6 catches this season for UCLA. We talked about Clay Helton in a previous segment dealing with USC, Nick. For Jim Mora, not nearly the pressure. He's done a nice job. He's elevated the program from mediocre status to postseason status, winning 9 and 10 football games a year, top 15, top 20 in the country. But 8 consecutive losses, obviously not most of those under his watch, but he's lost all his games against Stanford. Stanford has risen to be the standard in the Pac-12, and if Jim Mora wants to lift this program to where the expectation is that he's coming from the NFL to UCLA, this is the bellmark game. This is the milestone right here to get past Stanford.
Yeah, and what's weird is I believe he won 3 up until last season. I believe he won 3 straight against USC, which is sort of the big rivalry. So you got to beat your rival, of course, in college, particularly in college. But to really get where they kind of want to go or expect to go, sooner or later you're going to have to get through Stanford, and if not Stanford, then probably Oregon. If you're going to win Pac-12s, you're going to get to the New Year's Six. If you're going to get to the playoffs, you're going to have to go through these teams, and 8 straight losses. I don't believe UCLA has beaten Stanford since the George W. Bush administration, which is shockingly quite a while ago. So Jim Mora's got to get something figured out. Every year, though, it seems something happens where it looks like they've got him, and then things just break out and fall apart for UCLA. Like last year, the Francis Owusu catch. I don't know if you remember that one, but it was a flea flicker. Hogan actually underthrew it in the end zone. Owusu caught it around the guy's back, very much like that Ohio State catch against Oklahoma.
Noah Brown. Yep.
Noah Brown, but it was like a 60-yard pass instead of in the red zone. That's sort of a great metaphor for UCLA and Stanford. Like even when UCLA finally looks like they've got them, they've got a red hot defense coming in. Stanford's got a new offensive line, new quarterback this year. Seems like they got them, and then things just happen for UCLA, and it's I don't know where it comes apart. I don't even think David Shaw could explain it with all his Stanford education. This is the year, though. I think if UCLA is ever going to beat Stanford, I think this is the year they have to do it. And as soon as I say that, I already feel McCaffrey is going to get 400 all-purpose yards. So,
well, these teams were not comparable. You mentioned the game last year and the incredible play in the end zone, but these teams weren't very comparable at Stanford. The Cardinal won that game 56-35 or something like that, and UCLA was never in the game, and Josh Rosen was throwing the ball all over the place off his back foot because the pass rush was devastating. They just weren't comparable teams on that particular night, and there was a distinction throughout the season. Stanford was one of the 5 or 6 best teams in the country. UCLA we thought was maybe a top 15 team, but man, they lost to Nebraska in a bowl game. They got annihilated by USC. They were more like a top 40 team. So Jim Moore has raised it to a level, and now it's been
He
difficult for him to push past a certain status in the Pac-12 and nationally.
Yeah, I don't know what the situation there is. I know last year they had struggles because of injuries and everything hit them pretty hard, but there always seems to be another thing happens, and then another thing, and another thing, and another thing. They have the talent. They're hanging in there with the USCs and the Oregons of the Pac-12 on the recruiting trail. They're taking 5 stars away from USC out of Los Angeles. That used to never happen, like, at all. It just, like, you went to UCLA because you couldn't get into USC. Now UCLA is snatching them left and right. Or not because you couldn't get into USC, but you couldn't make the football team, I should say. Now UCLA is snatching these recruits away. So it's not a talent thing. And, you know, I believe Moore is 3-1 against USC, so I don't think it's them. Just something weird is going on with UCLA. They can't quite break that, like, they can't break into double-digit wins. And I don't know what it is, but Stanford seems to be like the symbol of that. Like, this is a really good team. 2014, when Stanford played UCLA, 2014, it was the last game of the season. Stanford was like the worst year they've had in a long time. They lost 5 games that season. And they came out and just annihilated UCLA. I think they won by 3 or 4 scores in that one, too. That should have been the year UCLA absolutely should have won that game. And so, you know, David Shaw can say things like all of the games that happened before Saturday no longer matter. But I feel like 8 in a row, and even when you clearly have more, even in the years you are a better team, you still lose. I think that's got to weigh on you if you're UCLA. I don't see how it can't. And at the same time, if you're David Shaw, like, don't get complacent just because I think he's trying to say just because we beat them 8 times in a row is not going to help us win number 9. But this should be a really interesting matchup. It's Ryan Burns, Stanford quarterback's first time on the road. But, you know, Stanford's played a game or 2 in the Rose Bowl before.
Yeah, that 2014 team for Stanford finished up at 8-5, but they won the bowl game. They beat UCLA in the last game of the season, so they entered that game at 6-5. And UCLA was primed to win the South Division championship and go to the Pac-12 championship game, and they had everything to play for. They lost 31-10 and let Arizona move on to the Pac-12 championship game and get blown out by Oregon when UCLA, by all rights, was the best team in the division. But let it slip away against what, at least for that one particular year, was a struggling for them Stanford team.
Yeah. And 10, 15 years ago, if you would have told Stanford they're going 8-5 that year, the place would have went nuts. But now 5 losses in a season is borderline cataclysmic.
All right, it's Stanford, it's UCLA at the Rose Bowl, and it's a big game for both teams, definitely in the Pac-12 mix, but especially for perception's sake and program building for Jim Mora at UCLA. Nick Dempsey from Rule of Tree helping us on the Cardinal and the Bruins. Thanks, Nick.
Anytime, Mark.